Okay, we're going to start our last module, or at least our last module that has new content in it, Module 9. And in many ways, this module is the most important module that we do in AP Macroeconomics. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that it is always, the content from this unit is always on the free response section of the AP exam. In the 15 years or so that we have examples, there has never yet been a year where in the free response section some sort of international economics did not show up. So that alone makes this unit very, very important, this module very important. The other thing that makes this module so important is the fact that the world is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And through technology, through trade, through improved communication, the idea that money and goods and services and economic practices are going to move between borders, back and forth between countries, faster and faster and faster, means that understanding international economics gets more and more important. The other thing that's nice about this unit is, though for some folks this can be a little bit confusing, it does also tie together many of the ideas that we've learned throughout the course of this entire course. So this is sort of a nice capstone for everything we've done so far. And so with all that said, let's go ahead and get started on this module. And to talk about international economics, which is the topic of this module, we have to begin by first talking about exchange rates. It's sort of the basic concept that we have when we start off with. So we'll begin that concept with a little definition. First, what is an exchange rate? We'll get to that graph at the bottom of your screen in just a minute. But let's start with what an exchange rate is. An exchange rate is very simple. It's the quantity of a currency that can be exchanged for a unit of another currency. So it's important to understand that there's no such thing as the United States exchange rate. There is, however, the exchange rate for the United States dollar with, let's say, the British pound. Or there is an exchange rate between the US dollar and, I happen to use the example here on my screen, of the Japanese yen. Maybe it's the European euro. Maybe it's the Indian rupee. Whatever it is, the exchange rate, there is no such thing as an exchange rate. An exchange rate really is how much does one currency get you of another currency, one unit of another currency. So in this case, let me kind of flesh this out by using a graph. Now you might be surprised that we're using a graph, but graphs, as usual, are a great way to explain what we're looking at. And you'll notice that I called it the exchange rate market. Currency, in this case, currency moving back and forth between countries, like everything else that we've talked about this year, has a market. There are those who want it, demanders, and those who possess it and are willing to supply it. And so with that in mind, we can start to understand what an exchange rate is. Let's start by looking at this graph here to the left. All exchange rates are based, again, on how much of one person's currency you get for a unit of another currency. In this example, we have the quantity of dollars in Japan. So we're looking at right now the market for dollars relative to the Japanese. And well, what is the Japanese currency? Well, the Japanese currency is the yen. So if I click this here, I'll put up this. This is essentially what the market for the dollar looks like in comparison to the Japanese yen. Again, in this case, what we're saying is the number of dollars, the quantity of dollars that you get is put here on the x-axis, and the number of yen that you get for $1. Now, remember that this slash mark here is said yen per dollar, which means the number of yen you get for a single dollar. In my example, it appears to be 2. So what that means essentially is, at this particular moment, for every dollar that is exchanged, an equal amount of 2 yen must be given back for that dollar. Okay, so far so good. Now, if it's true that 2 yen equal $1, it must also be true then, logically, that half a dollar equals a yen. Could we do that graphically as well? Well, we can. If we're looking at the market for dollars here relative to the yen, it seems as though we should also look at the market for yen relative to the dollar. Now, these graphs are not side-by-side graphs for those who might have taken microeconomics, but they are sort of interrelated graphs. Again, what we determined in the graph on the left is that in the market for dollars, you get 2 yen for the dollar. So on the graph on the right, what we can assume here is this. We have supply and demand, but in this case, we're talking about the supply and demand of the yen. If 2 yen equal a dollar, then in the yen market, we must have a half a dollar equaling 1 yen. And again, here we're saying dollars per yen. So we're saying 1/2 a dollar or 50 cents per yen. These two graphs must somehow work together. If this should change in any way, a change in one graph is going to have to represent a change in another graph, because remember, an exchange rate is a relationship between two currencies. We're showing on our screen now the market for both currencies relative to the other one. Now, here's where this gets a little complicated. Suppose there is an increase in demand for the dollar in Japan. For some reason, the Japanese want more American dollars. Now, we'll get into our next unit or our next lesson why that might happen. But for right now, let's just assume it does happen. There's an increase in the demand for the dollar in Japan. Well, what we've noticed here is that the demand has shifted to the right. Now, what does that mean? That means that the price of the dollar must have increased. Like anything else, if we demand more of something, that thing's price must increase. So instead of the Japanese only needing to give Americans 2 yen for the dollar, it looks like now they have to give them 4 yen for the dollar. So again, it used to be a moment ago that the Japanese had to give 2 yen in order to get a dollar. Now they have to give 4 because there's been an increase in demand. And again, that makes sense. The price of the dollar is the number of yen you get back. And like anything else, if the demand increases, the price must rise. So it went from 2 to 4. Okay, now, if the price of the dollar went from 2 yen to 4 yen, something else must be true. The price of the yen must have decreased. Logically, if we used to get a half a dollar for 1 yen, now, since we're getting 4 yen for $1, it must also be true that we only get a quarter of a dollar for the yen. Now, why does that make sense? Well, you'll notice that what happened is the supply of yen increased or shifted to the right. This relationship is always going to happen. So let's summarize all this together. If there's an increase, for example, in the demand for the dollar, which is happening over here in the left graph, the price of the dollar is going to rise from 2 yen to 4 yen. But because there was an increase in the demand for the dollar by Japanese citizens, the Japanese must have sent the United States something in exchange for those dollars. What did they send them? They sent them yen. And so the supply of yen in the United States simultaneously is increasing. And as the supply of something increases, the price drops from, again, in this case, half a dollar or 50 cents to a quarter of a dollar or a quarter. That's a basic transaction. Now, there's 2 other terms we want to make sure we mention here. Over here, because we get more yen for a dollar, going from 2 to 4, the dollar does what we call appreciating. Now, we could just say increases in value relative to the yen, but what we're going to start using is the word appreciate. The dollar appreciated relative to the yen, which means that the yen in the market on the right depreciated. Okay, so with that in mind, let's try to get some ideas together. First, let's take that word appreciate. If a nation's currency appreciates, what can we say is true? Well, the first thing, as we just learned, is that you get more of the other currency for your currency. So again, in the example we just did, What that means is, whereas the US used to get only 2 yen for the dollar, now they get 4 yen for the dollar. Now, because that's true, what it means is this, and this is really the important part to take away here. Japanese goods are now cheaper for the United States. Now, why is that exactly? Well, think about it before. Remember that a candy bar in Japan that used to cost 50 cents, remember that, think of it this way, 1 yen cost you 50 cents before. So let's say in Japan a candy bar cost 1 yen. It used to cost 50 cents to get that 1 yen, but because the US dollar appreciated, now it only costs 25 cents to get that same yen. And so the candy bar is now half as expensive as it used to be. So again, essentially for the United States, because our currency appreciated, all Japanese goods are cheaper to us. Now, what does that mean? The consequence of that is very important. It means that that our imports are going to increase. United States imports are going to increase because all of Japanese goods are cheaper. Now, that also consequently means the opposite, that US goods are now more expensive. You know, we often pound our chest about wanting to have a very strong currency, and that if we have an appreciated currency, we're going to be very powerful. Actually, usually a strong currency is a sign that your economy is doing well, but it does also mean often or always that it's more difficult for you to export your goods. Because again, now a US hamburger that used to cost a Japanese person 2 yen, now they have to pay 4. It's more expensive for them to buy our goods. And so what's going to happen? Exports are going to decrease. So very important to understand. If your currency appreciates, your imports to that other country, your imports from that other country will increase, but your exports to that other country will decrease. That concept is really critical and is going to be the crux of what we're going to be trying to do. By the way, in this lesson, you have an article to read about how China has for many years, according to much of the rest of the world, artificially kept their currency very, very low, their exchange rate very, very low, because they want their goods to be cheap so that they can export their goods to the rest of the world. And it's been a big issue with a lot of other countries. One of the things that we assume in this lesson is that exchange rates are flexible, that no government is forcing them to be any particular amount, that it's really just the market being allowed to do its job. But you can imagine why China might want to do that. Because, as we just learned, if your currency gets too valuable or appreciates too much compared to other currencies, your exports decrease. And that, of course, can hurt things in your country like jobs and your GDP. Okay, so to summarize, if a nation's currency depreciates, of course, the opposite, then their exports will increase and their imports will decrease. And again, that's what China has sort of artificially tried to do for some time. And you can see why. Okay, let's go ahead and do an example together. All right, in this question, suppose there is an increase in demand for the euro by the US. Illustrate the impact on the market for the dollar and the euro. What happens to the value of the euro? All right, so we need to draw two different markets. We're going to draw what's going to happen to the dollar and what's going to happen to the euro. Let's start with the market for the euro. On the left, we have the quantity of euros in the US, or the market for euros. Now, what is the price of a euro? The price of a euro is, in this instance, the number of dollars that you get for 1 euro. And that's what we marked here on the y-axis. So our exchange rate, or our price, essentially, for the euro is the number of dollars that we get for the euro. By the way, you can label that generically ER1, or exchange rate 1, but I always want to make sure it's clear that you label at least once, that you understand what this really means. The exchange rate is the number of dollars that you get for a euro. Okay, now before we move forward, we should also take a minute and look at the other market we're supposed to graph, the market for the dollar relative to the euro. So this is, we're going to do over here, the quantity of dollars in Europe. What is the price of that dollar? There you go. The number of euros for a dollar. And of course, we'll draw in our supply and demand. All right, now, and again, mark an exchange rate there as well. So we have our two markets in place now, the market for the euro on the left and the market for the dollar on the right. Now, what did the directions say? It says, suppose there's an increase in the demand for the euro by the US. Again, we don't know why that would happen. For right now, we just want to understand what happens when this occurs. So there's an increase in the demand for the euro. There it is. Demand is increased. Of course, we know that means that the exchange rate is going to rise. Or in other words, another way of saying that is that the number of dollars that you're going to get for the euro has increased. So if demand has increased for the euro and the exchange rate for the euro has risen, then what must also be true? Well, if the US was looking for more euros, they must have sent Europe something to get those euros. What did they send them? Dollars. And so the supply of dollars in Europe is increasing, which means that the exchange rate, or the number of euros that you get for the dollar, is decreasing. And that essentially is what we're looking for here. Now, what does that mean overall? The last part of the question asks, what happens to the value of the euro? Well, the euro, we seem to be getting more dollars than we used to for 1 euro. So that means the euro has appreciated. And even though they didn't ask, we'll also note that the dollar therefore has depreciated. Okay. Hopefully you're starting to get the hang of this. Let's keep going with example 1. Now, let's take a look at this. The question I'm going to ask here says, what will happen to the GDP in both nations after the change in exchange rates? Well, remember what happens. The euro appreciated in value and the dollar depreciated in value. So let's start with the GDP for European nations. What's going to happen there? Well, Europe's exports will decrease and its imports will increase. Why? Because the euro is more valuable, European goods are more expensive. And therefore, Americans will buy less of them. So Europe will export less. But American goods are now cheaper, and so imports to Europe will increase. Now, if that's true, and again, I'm just summarizing this because European goods are more expensive to the US. If that's all true, if exports are decreasing and imports are increasing, then overall, based on the rule of net exports, which we learned quite a while ago, GDP is going to decrease. So in the end, a higher valued currency, a more appreciated currency, will actually decrease the GDP. And of course, vice versa. Because the US currency depreciated in value, its imports will decrease. Their goods will be more expensive to us. But our exports will increase because our goods will be relatively cheaper to them. And again, we've summarized that here. So what's the consequence of that for our GDP? Well, our GDP will increase because, again, thinking about what net exports mean, exports have increased in the US and imports have decreased, and therefore GDP will increase. Okay, let's move on to a second example. Instead of talking about the euro this time, we're going to talk about the peso. So the question says there is less demand for the Mexican peso by the US. Illustrate the impact on the market for the peso and the dollar. Now, we're going to have to do two graphs again because it asks us for both the market for the peso and the dollar. We'll start with the peso. The peso is on the left. We have the market for the peso, the quantity of pesos that the US is interested in. Again, what is the price of the peso relative to the dollar? Well, it's the number of dollars that you get for 1 peso. Now let's move to the other market. We need to know the market for the dollar. Well, what is the price of the dollar in Mexico? Well, it's the number of pesos that you get for $1. And of course, the market for the dollar has a demand and a supply and an equilibrium exchange rate. All right, now back to the original question. We've so far now got both of our markets drawn in at least to start. Now it says there is less demand for the peso in the US. We don't necessarily, again, know why that would be yet, but for some reason there is. So we draw in a new demand curve, a decrease in demand. Now, as you can see, what that means is the exchange rate has decreased for the peso, or in other words, you get less dollars for every peso. If there's less demand for the peso by the United States, then the United States is going to be sending Mexico less dollars to get those pesos. Therefore, what's also true in the market for the dollar, the supply has decreased, which means the exchange rate has increased, or in other words, you get more pesos for the dollar. And when all is said and done, that means the peso has depreciated and the dollar has appreciated. And again, keep that in mind. The peso has depreciated, the dollar has appreciated. Now, what's the consequence of all that? If I continue this question, what will happen to the exports in both nations after the change in exchange rates? All right, summarizing, Mexico's exports will increase. Why will Mexico's exports increase? Because of the depreciation in value of the peso, Mexican goods are now cheaper to the US. However, US exports will decrease because the dollar appreciated, which means US goods are now relatively more expensive to Mexicans. Okay, hopefully you're starting to get the hang of this. Let's try one more problem. At this point, I'm going to ask you to stop the video, read the question, complete both graphs, and then we'll discuss the answer after you've had a chance to try this yourself. Okay, so here we go. Suppose there is an increase in the demand for the rupee, India's currency. Illustrate the impact on the market for the dollar and the market for the rupee. What happens to the value of the rupee? Okay, so we started you off here with a little help. The graph on the left got you started. The quantity of rupees in the US, we're going to do that market first. What is the price of a rupee in the US? The number of dollars that you get for a rupee. You also had to draw the graph for the dollar market in India. The price of a dollar in India is the number of rupees that you get per dollar. Of course, we have a supply and demand, and we marked our exchange rates. That's as far as we should have gotten at this point. Then I asked you to note that there was an increase in the demand for the rupee by the US. So the rupee's demand increased. You should have seen an increase in the exchange rate for the rupee, or in other words, the number of dollars for the rupee should have increased. If there's a more demand for the rupee, that must mean that there is also more supply of dollars in India, which means the exchange rate for the dollar has decreased, or the number of rupees per dollar has decreased. Finally, because all of this is true, we should have been able to say that the value of the rupee has appreciated. We have more dollars per rupee now. It's also worth noting that the value of the dollar has depreciated. Okay, let's continue this question. What will happen to the imports in both nations after the change in exchange rates? Explain. And again, stop the video here. Try to answer that question yourself, remembering that the rupee appreciated and the dollar depreciated. And then come back when you're ready. Okay, let's check our answers. Again, we want to know what happens to imports in both nations after the change in exchange rates. Rupee appreciated, the dollar depreciated. So, first, let's talk about India. India's imports are going to increase. Why? Because the rupee appreciated. That means that US goods are all now cheaper to India. We get more, the Indians get more dollars for every rupee. And so their imports, their ability to buy our things increases. It also means that US imports will decrease because right now Indian goods are more expensive to the US because the dollar depreciated, or we get less rupees for the dollar. Okay, hopefully you've got the hang of this. This was a long lesson, but a very important start to a very important module.